Hernán Cortés crosses a stone causeway above the surface of Lake Texcoco. It is the 8th of November, 1519. Behind him march roughly 400 Spanish soldiers. Ahead lies Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Triple Alliance, home to 200,000 people, one of the largest cities on Earth. The empire it commands draws tribute from a population estimated at 25 million across central Mexico. Within 100 years, 22 of those 25 million people will be dead. The textbook answer to what happened next is short. The Spanish conquered the Aztecs. Survivors and conquerors intermarried. Over 5 centuries, the modern Mexican people emerged. A blend, a mixture, a mestizo nation. That answer is not wrong, but it is not the whole story either. When researchers finally sequenced the genomes of more than 1,000 Mexican individuals, drawn from across the country, the data did not show a smooth, even blend. It showed something far sharper, a layered record of migration, collapse, and survival, stretching back 15,000 years and forward to the present day. The full story of where Mexicans come from has never been told this way before. Until now, it was buried in the chromosomes themselves. The story does not begin in 1519. It begins more than 15,000 years earlier, when the first humans crossed the Beringia land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, more than 15,000 years ago. They moved south in waves, spreading across 2 continents before rising sea levels sealed the land bridge shut around 11,000 years ago. By roughly 2000 BC, the people who had settled in the region historians call Mesoamerica had begun to build permanent civilizations, supported by intensive farming and irrigation. The earliest of these was the Olmec, centered in the tropical lowlands of modern Veracruz and Tabasco, famous for carving colossal stone heads from solid basalt. Their society peaked between roughly 1,200 and 400 BC and laid the cultural foundation for everything that followed. When the Olmec declined, Teotihuacan rose in their place, in the Valley of Mexico. By the middle of the first millennium AD, it was home to an estimated 125,000 people, its skyline dominated by the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. Around the same time, in the Yucatan and beyond, the Maya built their own monumental cities, developed a written language, and tracked the movements of the stars with extraordinary precision. None of these civilizations vanished without a trace. Their populations stayed, intermarried, splintered, and resettled across the same valleys, deserts, and coastlines for thousands of years. By the time the Aztecs rose to power, the genetic landscape of Mesoamerica was already a mosaic, regional, layered, and ancient. This is the foundation that every modern Mexican genome is built on top of. Not a blank slate waiting for Europeans to arrive, but 15,000 years of accumulated human history, already split into the regional populations that DNA can still distinguish today. Tenochtitlan, when Cortés finally saw it, was unlike anything the Spanish had encountered in the New World. Founded in 1325 on an island in Lake Texcoco, the city was connected to the mainland by massive engineered causeways and home to roughly 200,000 people, comparable in size to the largest cities of Europe. At its center stood a great pyramid, the religious heart of the city and the site of mass human sacrifice. The Aztecs themselves were not a single people, but an alliance of 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, bound together as the Triple Alliance. Through a combination of military conquest and economic domination, this alliance had come to rule over much of central Mexico, extracting tribute from a population estimated at somewhere between 4 and 25 million people, depending on which historical estimate you use. But the Aztecs were never the only civilization on the landscape. To the west, the Tarascan kingdom remained independent, never conquered by Aztec armies. To the south, in Oaxaca, the Zapotec and Mixtec controlled cities that had already stood for centuries. Across the Yucatan, the Maya persisted in fragmented city-states. To the north, beyond the reach of Aztec tribute collectors, lived the Yaqui, the Tarahumara, and other peoples of the desert frontier. This was the world Cortés was walking into in 1519. Not an empty continent, not a single nation, but a patchwork of distinct populations, each with its own deep genetic history, about to be struck by the same catastrophic event at the same moment in time. In February 1519, Hernán Cortés set sail from Cuba with roughly 500 men, aiming to bring the rich civilizations rumored to exist in Mesoamerica under Spanish control. He landed on the Gulf Coast and founded Veracruz, the first Spanish town on Mexican soil. From there, Cortés began to gather information and allies. Many of the peoples under Aztec rule resented the tribute demands placed on them and saw the arrival of the Spanish as an opportunity. The Totonacs at Chempoala allied with Cortés early. The Tlaxcalans, after first fighting the Spanish to a standstill, negotiated a treaty and joined the march toward Tenochtitlan as well, bringing with them thousands of warriors who would form the backbone of the campaign. By November 1519, Cortés and his combined force entered Tenochtitlan and took the Aztec ruler Moctezuma hostage. The relationship between the Spanish and the city collapsed within months. In 1520, the Spanish were driven out in a desperate retreat, remembered as the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. They returned the following year with reinforcements and a much larger force of native allies and laid siege to the city. On the 13th of August, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was over. The city was renamed Mexico City and rebuilt as the capital of a new Spanish territory called New Spain. This is the part of the story everyone knows. The part told in textbooks, painted in murals, dramatized in films. Soldiers, sieges, alliances, betrayals, the fall of an empire in 2 years. But here's the detail that rarely makes it into the story. The conquest itself, with all its violence, killed at most a few 100,000 people. That is a fraction of what was coming next. The military conquest of Tenochtitlan was not what destroyed the population of Mexico. Disease was. In 1520, before the siege had even concluded, smallpox arrived with Spanish reinforcements landing at Veracruz. The indigenous population of the Americas had never encountered the virus before and had no inherited immunity to it. It tore through the Valley of Mexico ahead of the Spanish advance, killing somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population in its first wave alone. Among its victims was Cuitlahuac, the Aztec leader who had organized resistance after Moctezuma's death. Smallpox was only the beginning. Measles arrived in 1531. Typhus followed in 1545. Influenza and mumps swept through in recurring waves over the following decades. But the deadliest epidemic of all was one that, for centuries, no one could even identify. The indigenous survivors called it cocoliztli, a Nahuatl word simply meaning pestilence. The first major outbreak hit in 1545 and lasted 3 years. A second wave struck in 1576 and lasted 4. Together, these two epidemics are estimated to have killed millions of people, by some accounts, as many as 15 million. For more than 400 years, the cause of cocoliztli remained a mystery. Its symptoms didn't match smallpox, measles, or typhus, and it left no clear trace in the skeletal record. Then, in 2018, researchers extracted ancient DNA from teeth recovered in a mass grave in Oaxaca, dated to the first cocoliztli wave. The pathogen they found was a strain of Salmonella enterica, a form of paratyphoid fever, almost certainly carried across the Atlantic in the bodies of Spanish or African travelers. By around 1620, a century after Cortés first crossed the causeway, the indigenous population of central Mexico had collapsed. By some estimates, by as much as 80 to 90%, 25 million people had become roughly 3 million. Before I show you the last part, if you've ever looked at your own results and wondered where Mexican ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put it all together in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is in the description, but stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. This is where the genetic record becomes forensic. In 2014, researchers at Stanford University, working with Mexico's National Institute of Genomic Medicine, published a landmark study sequencing more than 1,000 Mexican individuals, drawn from indigenous and mestizo populations across the country. The headline finding was straightforward. The modern Mexican genome is a three-way mixture, roughly 50 to 60% indigenous American, 30 to 40% European, and 3 to 8% African, on average, with significant regional variation. But the average numbers only tell part of the story. To understand how that mixture actually happened, researchers had to look at two very specific pieces of the genome: the Y chromosome, which passes only from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which passes only from mother to child. These lineages don't blend, they trace a single unbroken line, and when researchers examined them separately, the result was striking. Roughly 70 to 80% of Mexican men carry Y chromosome lineages of European origin, primarily types common in Spain and the wider Mediterranean. Indigenous American Y chromosome lineages appear in only 20 to 30% of men, despite indigenous ancestry making up half or more of the genome overall. Mitochondrial DNA tells the opposite story. Roughly 85 to 90% of Mexican women carry mitochondrial lineages that are indigenous American in origin, the same founding lineages that arrived across Beringia thousands of years earlier. European mitochondrial lineages are rare. Translated into human terms, on the paternal side, the vast majority of Mexican family trees led back, 400 or 500 years ago, to a Spanish man. On the maternal side, they lead back, in that same window of time, to an indigenous woman. That is not a small statistical detail. It is the genetic signature of the conquest itself, written into nearly every Mexican family that exists today. The indigenous half of the Mexican genome is often described as a single category, Native American or Amerindian, as if it were one uniform thing. The 2014 Stanford and Indigenous study showed that this is far too simple. When researchers separated out the European and African ancestry and looked closely at what remained, they didn't find one indigenous population. They found 4. Each of these 4 components has a clear geographic center, and each corresponds to a real, documented culture area from before the conquest. The first is centered in the northwest, the deserts and mountains of Sonora and Chihuahua. It matches the Yaqui, Tarahumara, and other peoples who lived there in 1519 and still live there today, populations that were never part of the Aztec Triple Alliance and were largely beyond its reach. The second is centered on the Valley of Mexico and the surrounding highlands. It corresponds to the Nahua peoples, the descendants of the populations that built Tenochtitlan itself. Because this was the largest population before the conquest, and the largest surviving population after it, this is the single biggest indigenous component in the entire national genome. The third is centered in Oaxaca, matching the Zapotec and Mixtec peoples, whose cities at Monte Alban and Mitla were already ancient when Tenochtitlan was founded. Partly isolated by mountainous terrain, this population shows the most genetically distinct signal of the 4. The fourth is centered on the Yucatan Peninsula, matching the Maya, a civilization already 2,000 years old in 1519, geographically separated from central Mexico, and still genetically distinguishable today. These 4 signals have survived epidemics, colonization, revolution, and a century of internal migration. Today, they sit quietly inside the DNA of 130 million people, a regional map of pre-Hispanic Mexico, hidden in plain sight in every chromosome. The non-indigenous half of the Mexican genome is not a single thing either. Start with the African component. Nationally, it averages only 3 to 8% small, easy to overlook, but it is not spread evenly. Between roughly 1,520 and the abolition of slavery in Mexico in 1829, an estimated 250,000 enslaved Africans were brought to New Spain, arriving through ports like Veracruz, Campeche, and Acapulco, and put to work on coastal plantations, in silver mines, and in port cities. In certain communities along the Veracruz coast, in the Costa Chica region of Guerrero and Oaxaca, in towns like El Ciruelo and San Nicolas Tolentino, that ancestry never diluted away. There, the African component in modern residents can run far above the national average. Then there is the European component, the 30 to 40% labeled simply Spanish. But Spain itself was never one population. A 2019 study sequencing ancient Iberian DNA found that the Spanish genome is itself a stack of layers. Neolithic farmers who arrived around 7,000 years ago, Bronze Age herders from the Eurasian steppe who arrived around 4,000 years ago, a North African component introduced during centuries of Moorish rule, and a Sephardic Jewish component dating back to before the expulsion of 1492. The Spanish men who crossed the causeway with Cortés carried this entire 4,000-year history on their chromosomes and passed it directly into the Mexican gene pool. On top of all of this, colonial Mexico built a rigid caste system, sorting people by ancestry into peninsulares, criollos, mestizos, and indios. Yet even as that system tried to separate populations, daily life fused them in food, in music, in religion, in the blending of Catholic and indigenous traditions that produced holidays like Dia de los Muertos, The genome doesn't recognize the categories the caste system invented. It only records what actually happened. Stand back from all of it, and the picture becomes clear. The story of where Mexicans come from was never wrong. Exactly, it was just incomplete. Mestizo is true, but it hides a far more specific, far more dramatic history. 15,000 years of indigenous civilization, already split into distinct regional populations, long before Cortés arrived. A conquest that killed in the hundreds of thousands. A series of epidemics, smallpox, cocoliztli, and others that killed millions of people in a century, among the deadliest demographic collapses in recorded human history. A recovery built almost entirely on the backs of a few million survivors. A pattern of mixing so asymmetric that it left a permanent signature: Spanish fathers, indigenous mothers written into the chromosomes of nearly every family. 4 distinct indigenous nations, still detectable today, each tracing back to a real culture area from before 1519. And layered on top of all of it, a 4,000-year history out of Iberia and the quieter, often erased contribution of enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic. None of this was visible in any document, any census, any family story passed down through generations. It was invisible until now. 130 million people are walking around today carrying this entire history in their cells. The chromosomes don't know about nations, or borders, or textbooks. They only know what actually happened.